Hello, guys. David Vose here again, and I'll be darned if it isn't another beautiful day. I mean, it's just like summer. Literally, it's warm. It was warm last night, in the middle of the night. Um, it's just miraculously beautiful, and I'm enjoying it, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Well, friends, this is going to be maybe more or less a continuation of the video we did yesterday. I sense that a lot of you don't really fancy this subject. Maybe you're bored with it, or you think that some of what I'm saying is you heard over and over again. Well, there are some things that you're going to hear over again here, but I have to put all the facts down in this video. But I'm going to move into some things you have never heard, and we're going to establish today something that is very important. I mean, this should be such a shock to the world if they knew about it. If any of these Bavarian scholars could hear this video, and I guess they're not listening, and I don't think any of the other YouTube scholars are wanting to run with any of this as well. They're still off chasing lies and NASA beliefs and government conspiracies. And they're not awoken yet to this truth. And there's many things we could talk about that would shake the world to find out that we've been lied to about something. And this is something I think is important because the biggest conspiracy today that we're living under is that there is a chosen race of people that lives in Palestine, and we're going to now have a one world government based on these people. And we're going to go back under this law that Jesus came to free us from. Now, if we do go back under the law and they sacrifice that red heifer, those who consent to it will then be under the judgment of Yahweh, and there will be a wrath to pay. And I've been saying this and saying it, and I think people are like, well, that's kind of funny, that's kind of interesting, Dave. Friends, this is so important. We need to get this to everyone. Everybody's got to hear this. If nobody ever grasps or gets this, then it must be that the Lord only wants a certain few to even know this, or a certain few can even grasp this. It does say in the Bible that Satan is going to deceive the whole world, every man, woman, and child. And everyone would be deceived, universally, except for the elect. He wants to deceive them if it's possible, but it will not be possible. There will be a certain number who will come off victorious. And this is part of the message you need to understand. If you don't understand that law and order means wrath, judgment, and punishment, and the only way to escape it is to receive the love of the truth that you might be saved. So, we've got a whole scenario. Some are preaching because they are liars, and some are preaching it because they are duped. Most of them are just duped. But there's this rationalism that's been going forth, Darwinism and Freudism and all the isms that you know of, and the deity is dead and all that kind of thing, evolution and science. And you say, well, that's just science, Dave. They didn't change the religion. Well, they financed all these religions, and they're all wrong. And all the Christian religions are following Yahweh and demanding prisons and war and backing the whoremongers all around the world. And they're going to bring us to the brink of World War III, and then there will be Armageddon. Because they would not believe in what Jesus told them, they are apostate. And this goes, much deeper than just they don't believe Jesus' words. They don't even know that Jesus wasn't coming as a Jew and telling everybody to keep all the laws of Jewry and go under the slavery. And so this whole thing that there was this Masoretic scribes that have this authority to translate the Bible and know the ancient Hebrew, and they had these ancient manuscripts of the Bible, and the Torah is so important. It's a big hoax. There are no, as I keep saying, there are no Hebrew manuscripts of the Torah. And in fact, there are none BC except for in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll talk about. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls are not what you think they are either. They are a group of individuals called Essenes, which are a worldwide organization and have nothing to do with Judaism. But let me show you something here and we'll get right into this. And just keep in mind that there's going to be a few things that some of you who are longtime listeners have heard before, but we need to put all this in perspective and cover it one step at a time so that we can come to the proper conclusion by the time we're done. And I hope that you'll share this with as many scholars and people out there that need to know this information, because we need to tell the world what's really going on. So AI says, when asked, what proof is there that the Torah existed before Christ? And that's all I'm asking. Not 1000 BC or 500 BC, but just any time before Christ. And of course, we hear all these stories about these Hebrew manuscripts that exist, and we talked about that yesterday, but this is the primary evidence. They should have just said the only, but the primary evidence supporting the existence of the Torah before the Common Era, BCE, comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of ancient manuscripts discovered in the late 20th century, which include fragments of the Torah dating back to the 3rd century BCE. Okay, that throws you a little bit, because when they say 3rd century, it means in the 100 years, that's the third one. So it wasn't in the first 100 years, it wasn't in the second 100 years, but it could have been 210 years, but that would have been the 3rd century. See, they just say 3rd century, as if they don't have a date, but they're just saying maybe it was the 3rd century. Additionally, early non-biblical sources, like the letter of Aristeas, mention a translation of the Torah into Greek during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, 285 to 247 BCE, indicating its existence prior to that time. Well, the only Torah that we know of is the one written in Greek. By the 72, the Sanhedrin, that's what a 72 means, guys. So just think about this. There are 72 individuals on a Sanhedrin in Alexandria, priests from Heliopolis, Judeans by trade, that do not live up in Palestine. 280 BC, the Zadokite priesthood was in Heliopolis, and there was a temple there, and it was a city called Jerusalem. And they had a Sanhedrin. And that was the one that Jesus later came into and chose 72 himself and 12. And that's why we don't have a lot of information about Jesus up there in Palestine as much. But we have references to him, but he was down beyond the Jordan at Bethany, or the house of On, Beth On, where John the Baptist was, the last of the Zadokite priests, other than Jesus and James, which, we translated James, but it's Jacob. And they were at Heliopolis, the city of Beth Ani, or the house of On. And we know that is not just some coincidence. Beth Ani means on, because on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus was going on the road to Emmaus, you can do research and find out that that is another way of saying Heliopolis. So Jesus was on the way to Heliopolis with his disciples when their eyes were opened and they were enlightened. But we've gone through a lot of this proof before. I'm just pointing out that the only evidence of a Torah is in the Septuagint version, or the only Bible there was BC, that was certainly the only authorized version. It was authorized by the Sanhedrin. The Judeans up in Palestine, or Herod's temple, which is of the tribe of Esau, there were some Judeans there, a group of Pharisees and some Sadducees and some scribes, evidently, according to the Bible, where Jesus went up there and condemned them. But that's not where Jesus was preaching. He went and got baptized or initiated into the rites of John, who was beyond the Jordan, somewhere far away at the house of On. And we've also shown absolute proof that Bethel, where the 10 tribes' headquarters was in their temple, was Heliopolis. And by the way, the Septuagint that has the Torah written in Greek does not have the word Yahweh in it. Everywhere you find this tetragrammation, Yahweh, today, it was added by Masoretic scribes, Jewish scribes, from 1000 AD, 1100 AD, after Christ. And they're frauds. They had no authority to translate, and they had no ancient manuscripts to translate from. They started early on, right after Christ, taking the Septuagint and translating it into a language that they invented. It wasn't any paleographic Hebrew. It's modern, what they call modern Hebrew, but it's more like an Aramaic Syrian script. But it's more modern. And we can prove, we'll show you here, that where the Dead Sea Scrolls have some kind of this Aramaic Hebrew, they are translated from the Septuagint. They were never translated. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not translated from a Hebrew manuscript or a Hebrew Torah. There was no Yahweh in it. They were looking at the Septuagint without a Yahweh, where they translated it Kyrios, or the Lord. And so the Bibles up until recently all just had the Lord. But this movement, this Zionism or whatever, that's spreading, and people are being deceived by this lie that these Masoretic scribes had these ancient Hebrew manuscripts and Yahweh was in there. It's not true. We have no idea if the word Yahweh is in the Bible. Certainly not in the New Testament at all, even though people like Jehovah's Witnesses are putting it in there. It is blasphemy what they're doing. They have no authority to do so. And none of the translations have any authority to put Yahweh in any part of the Bible, Old or New Testament. Because the only Bible we ever had was the Septuagint that does not have Yahweh. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are translating from the Septuagint because of we can prove that because of the language. Well, some of the Masoretic scribes have a different version of the Bible. They take out the virgin birth and the sacrifice of Christ and his deity and so forth. But the Dead Sea Scrolls follow the Septuagint exactly. They do not follow this fake Masoretic scribe version of 1100 AD, which is a fraud. So what we're saying then is that the Judean peoples, the Israelite peoples, were taken into captivity between 720, the 10 tribes, and 600, the 2 tribes of Judea, 600 BC. And from that point forward, at least from then on, they spoke Persian a couple of hundred years, and then they spoke Greek in 330 when Alexander leveled Heliopolis, and then they started moving the library over to Alexandria. The entire world spoke Greek. And all the Judeans from 330 onward began to speak Greek. Everybody in the world, in that known world, spoke Greek. And so they were the Hellenized Judeans. They were Hellenized. And Philo and Josephus and Pliny and these Jewish priests were down at Alexandria and Heliopolis, studying there in the libraries with other Judeans, priests, and a Sanhedrin, where John the Baptist was. And we've shown that Josephus tells you all about this, but everybody in the world is ignoring it, and they're being mesmerized to be under the impression that this didn't exist. Now, we talked about the Elephantine Judeans, which is further south in Egypt, And they were building a temple. This is south of Thebes, quite a bit further south, down the Nile. And what they have left behind, all their writings and all their understanding of who they were as Judeans, there is no mention of the Torah. They didn't even have a Torah at that time, which predates the one made in the Septuagint Greek language in 280 BC. So this predates it. So before 280 BC, we have no record of the Torah. Judeans around the world never knew about a Torah because there wasn't any real Bible at that time. Synagogues got started after 280 BC, and that's when they began to write things down because they were all worshiping and going to the synagogues. Before that, we hear about this great temple, Solomon's temple, but we've never found it in Palestine. It didn't exist there. If Solomon's temple existed there, according to history, it never said that Solomon's temple was razed to the ground and all the stones were taken somewhere. It should be there, but we can't find any hide nor hair of it. Now, I'm not sure if when I say that you're understanding what I'm pointing out here. You might think, well, so what? Maybe it got buried in the sand, or, they can't find it. Okay, but it might have been there. Well, look at the temple at Baalbek. They find underground blocks and cities everywhere all around the world. We know about the Temple of Artemis. We know where it is. There's remnants of it still standing. The Eleusinian temples and the Temple of Delphi in Athens there. And we have the Temple of Dionysus. We have all the great pyramids along the Nile. I mean, Luxor and Denver and all the other different temples. We have found and we can locate every temple that we could imagine in history books. Magnificent monuments, stones that are astronomical in their weight, and it's profound. But we have no idea where the Temple of Solomon is. No idea. Where anything in the Bible, in the Old Testament, about the temples or the city of David or monuments that Jacob made or Abraham made or whatever, unless they were just little rocks, we have no way to locate them. They don't exist. And most people don't realize, because they see this Wailing Wall down there, there it is, Dave. That's Herod's temple. That's after the captivity, where the Judeans came there and tried to rebuild some kind of a temple, but it certainly wasn't the true temple, and they didn't even have the true priesthood, which we'll find out is the Zadokite priesthood, which the Dead Sea Scrolls that we're going to talk about briefly, or a little more than briefly, talk about this Zadokite priesthood. That's why they wouldn't sacrifice or do anything. They didn't even eat meat, so they certainly wouldn't sacrifice at the Temple of Jerusalem. They had nothing in common with these people. And these were what we call Essenes, and we'll talk about them. But they thought that the temple there, Herod's temple, was defiled. They didn't have the right priesthood. They mention it all the time, that the teacher of righteousness, or Zadokite priest, is the only proper priesthood, which we will show you, beyond any doubt, was down at Heliopolis at that time, and not at Jerusalem. And the Judeans will admit that. The onious priesthood of the Zadokite line was at Heliopolis. There is absolute proof of what I'm saying here. We're going to show you this. This is not just me making up a story. Although no one else anywhere in the world is talking about this. Anywhere. It's been hidden from the entire world, even though it's been right there in plain sight. But no one dared to look at the evidence, because all the scholars are of this Bavarian ilk that we always talk about, and they refuse to go against their conspiracy that they have created. This conspiracy that land over there in Palestine is the homeland of these sacred chosen individuals. And that is all false. And there was no ancient Hebrew Bible, and the Masoretic scribes are a hoax. And it sounds crazy, and some of you have been hearing me say all this, and I'm sorry for having to repeat some of this today. But we're going to get into some factual evidence, and we're going to lay it out line by line, point by point, so that you will never have to wonder or doubt again who these individuals are over there trying to make this crazy New Jerusalem or sacrifice a red heifer or whatever they're doing. But that Jesus and John the Baptist and true Christianity is not what you think it is. It has nothing to do with them. And yes, Jesus has genealogy back to Judah, but only back to Ruth. That's why we got the Bible book of Ruth, where it tells you the Levirate marriage, where Boaz, a Jew, was raising up seed for Joseph. Because Jesus would be the fulfillment of the promised seed who had the birthright, which went to Joseph. Now, legally, as it says, as it was according to the law, if you traced his genealogy back, it would be through the Judeans who are raising up seed. But the one who has the legal right is the Canaanite woman, who is the woman who gives birth to the promised Messiah. And so Joseph went down into Egypt at Heliopolis and married Asenath, a Canaanite, and this was the promised lineal seed. And then we trace it from Miriam, Moses' sister, all the way down from Bethlehem to King David and into Jesus Christ, and we'll talk about that too. Now, yes, there were Judeans there in the first century, and Jesus went there and he talked about, said he wouldn't go up there. And at one point around Passover, he finally went there and they crucified him. But he didn't hang around there because they didn't like him. But you say, okay, but we've got these Dead Sea Scrolls, 3rd century. Well, 200 and something. 200 and something. Well, we know that there was a Torah then. It was written in Greek. So what are these Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, they're not paleographic Hebrew that people are claiming existed. We have no hide nor hair of that. Or any Solomon's temple in that area. Now, yes, we will show that all of this that supposedly is in our Bible happened, but it happened down in Egypt. You know, back in the ancient times when King David and Abraham, all these people were in Egypt. The Bible says that Abraham went to the Nile and stood on the mountain, and he looked west, east, north, and south, and the Lord said, all the land you see, I will give it to thee. So the land west of the Nile, the land east of the Nile, the land north of the Nile, the land south of the Nile, which is pretty much the world, because where he was standing is Cairo, and it's the center, geographical center of the entire land masses of all the world. We can prove that Abraham was there in Egypt, and we all know that they lived there for 500 years in the land of Goshen before the exodus of Moses. So what was the exodus of Moses? Well, they went out from down in the southern Egypt, in the Sudan, where they were being tasked to build these pyramids. But the Septuagint does use a Greek term that they translate Red Sea. So, okay, it had to have been the Red Sea then that we're seeing on the map today. Well, we call that the Red Sea today. But in ancient times, they didn't call that the Red Sea. This is just a word that we find in the Septuagint 280 BC. And it began to be designated Red Sea, but nobody really knew where the Red Sea was. So we don't know that Moses led them across the Red Sea. We just know that he crossed a sea or a body of water. Now, it could have actually been coming from southern Egypt across the channels, and there's reeds and ponds and lakes in that area. It could have been crossing there back into the land of Goshen. And from Goshen, there were certain Israelites that scattered out from there all around. Now, the scenario that we've been told is that Moses led them out and then went to Palestine. But it doesn't say that. It says they wandered around and around 40 years. Now, Jesus talks about being from Galilee. Now, the word Galilee is from the word gal, which means wheel. And, by the way, it's called Galilee of the nations, right? So it wasn't where they started. It was the circuit to go all the way around of all the different nations. Galilee of the nations, the circuit that leads to all the way around to all the nations. It's translated the circuit. So people think that there's a place called Galilee. There may have been in the days of Herod because they renamed everything. But originally that word Galilee meant the circuit. And there was another place where we have the word Gilgal, where they made 12 stones, because it's the circuit of astrology. The circuit of the stars that go around and around, day and night. And as we said, Cairo, Egypt, where the Great Pyramid is the center of all the land masses, continental land masses of the world. So they went out from the center to the circuit, and they went around and around 40 years. So now, think about this. 40 years. There's 360 days in a symbolic year. So 40 times 360 is 14,400. It's a multiple of the 144,000. So the 144,000 is 12,000 from each tribe. So when it says they went 40 years, it's counting the days, it's the 144,000. They were dividing up the world, and the firstborn would be the 144,000. And then beyond that is the stars that differ in star and glory. This, the multitude of nations, like the stars of heaven, shall be thy seed. So the ultimate fulfillment is the entire world. And like Hosea and Isaiah, where it prophesies, this will be the end of it. The great multitude will be all nations, tribes, and tongues. They'll colonize the entire world. But probably in the days of Moses, initially, where were the children of Israel? Where was the land of Israel? Well, the center was Cairo, and it went around in a circle as far as they could go at that time, into Africa, up through the Middle East, up into Europe, Greece, Morocco, or initially that area that encompassed Cairo was the promised land. And it did extend up into the lower parts of Palestine and all the way up into Greece. But that was only one tribe. That wasn't the whole land of Palestine, because Abraham was told, as far as you can see, standing on the Nile, east, west, north, and south, wherever thy foot tread, I will give it to thee. And when they got to the Jordan, it says they put 12 stones that they got from the sea. It has to do with baptism and going through the Jordan to be baptized in the river. Well, we're talking about entering into an incarnation of this world in astrology and going into the gradations of the wheel. The bottom of the wheel is lower and the higher part is the kingdom of Uranus. And so we won't go into all of this, but it's very symbolic of the journey and being baptized by Noah through the flood, or January, John, January, the man with the watering picture, the Aquarian man, and he will baptize you. But we're going to the upper room at the Passover when we pass over into the higher or the upper room when we get the Holy Spirit, and we go up the mountain to the Father's kingdom and marry Andromeda. Perseus marries Andromeda and the great wedding. So this story of the 12 tribes and the 72 nations, all of them, the mixed multitude followed them. There were 12,000 from each tribe on their horses, and they had their banners and their emblems, each representing one of the houses of the astrological wheel. And behind them was the great mixed multitude that came up out of Egypt. And where did they go? They were by lot, 12 lots, 12 portions, dividing up the land of promise, which is the entire world. And the book of Hosea and other places talks about how they will end up going onto the eternal, everlasting mountains of Israel. So Israel has mountains or governments, and they're an infinite circle. But we won't go too deeply into that. We've covered it a little bit in other videos. But this is very symbolic. They didn't go to Palestine. They went, and each of the tribes got a lot as they went around for 360 degrees, covering the entire world. They spread out, possibly even up into what we call Palestine today. But their city, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and all of these grand cities were down in the area around Egypt, along the Nile. So they say then that the only evidence for a Hebrew version of the Bible is, and not paleographic, but just this modern type of Hebrew, kind of a Aramaic version of the scriptures, is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which they just loosely say was maybe 100 BC, maybe 200. Well, that's interesting because they're just guessing. They don't have any actual dates. As you know, I'm not a real big fan of carbon dating. I'm not a believer in anything these Bavarians do. But I'm going to say that while it's not proof that we have anything in Hebrew BC, it does fit with what I believe, that the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Essenes may have existed a couple of hundred years before Christ, because, as I've said, we've got the Serapis Christ, we've got the whole Zoroastrianism from Daniel down, and the Temple of Artemis and stuff. And so we know that these teachings that the Essenes had were before Christ. Actually, we know beyond any doubt, we've got the whole Maccabean revolt and the Apocrypha, the Maccabees' writings, which tell us that the Zadokite priesthood went to Heliopolis. And they were there from probably 300 BC. So yeah, 300 BC, they were down there in Heliopolis. They eventually, in 280 BC, translated this, whatever document they had, into Greek. They may have had some Hebrew type writing, but we don't have it today. It's been lost. We don't have any of the Hebrew that they may have used to translate the Bible in 280 BC. But we know that they existed, the Zadokite priesthood, which is the Essenes, because they tell you that they are the Zadokite priests. And they were in all the cities throughout the world, according to Josephus. And so evidently, they themselves, and as we've said, translated from the Septuagint, which is the only Torah that ever existed, the Greek. But because some of these went into some monastic place or whatever, they were speaking some holy language or whatever, they went and translated the Septuagint Greek into some kind of Aramaic modern type supposed Hebrew. But we know they were translating the Septuagint because the version or the information agrees with the Septuagint and not with the Masoretic scribes. So who were the Essenes 200 years before Christ? Out there baptizing in the desert and having a Isaiah scroll, a Damascus document. They were in Damascus. You know, Paul went on the road to Damascus. They were in Egypt. They were all of these places. And they had this communal order. Who were these individuals? Well, we'll find out. I'm going to read this, a little bit of this, the mystic community of Essenes. And this is really eye-opening. And I read it for you because I don't want you to just think I'm making this up. Because I've said many times what the Essenes were. They were priests at the Temple of Artemis. We have that verified beyond a doubt. But we've also said that this Temple of Artemis is the greater religion. It's the world religion of that time. And was originally down there at Heliopolis and spread out from there. So I want to just share with you this information here. It says the nature of the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls have continued to engage generations of seekers. This 1967 essay adapted from the Rosicrucian Digest considers the mystical aspect of the Essene tradition. There was eager anticipation in the years following the Second World War when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. It was a discovery that engendered a growing consciousness of unique order shrouded in mystery for centuries. Who were the Essenes, who referred to themselves as the sons of Zadok? Well, let me just tell you, friends, Josephus tells us, all the historians, you can find this in Pliny and all, this is just fact. The Zadokite priesthood was not in Palestine. It was at Heliopolis, where they rebuilt a temple, a Jerusalem temple. It was called the Tower, there were several of these towers in the end. They had other temples, but it started there at Heliopolis, the Tower. You can find out about the Tower with Joseph going down to Egypt, marrying Asenath at the Tower. So it was an ancient religion starting from Heliopolis, where the mysteries were the original Jerusalem. So the Zadokite priesthood, there's no question, was at Heliopolis during the days of Jesus Christ. None of the priests in Palestine or Herod's temple had the Zadokite priesthood. Now, we know the Dead Sea Scrolls, whoever they are, the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves do not ever mention Essenes, ever. We have no idea who these people were that were writing these. All it was basically is a big library of books. And whoever these individuals were, they certainly were at Damascus. There was a Damascus scroll, which is where, remember, Paul was on the road to Damascus? So they were all over in various cities, because Josephus tells us they're in many cities, all over in every city. But Josephus gives us, and I mean, you can just look this up on AI yourself real quickly, and you'll see that from the time of the Maccabees, there was a series of Johns, or Onius, which is the is at the end is just the suffix in Greek. They always have a different suffix. Paulos, Apollyon, right? Apollo, but it's still Paul. So the suffix at the end of names changes depending on the tense of the verb and so forth. So the Zadokite priesthood was at Heliopolis. And the guy who was the Zadokite priest was John. And then after John was a Jesus, many times translated Jason or Jason, and a Jacob, that we in our Bible translate James, but he was James the righteous. Righteous is the Zadokite priest. The teacher of righteousness is the Zadokite teacher. And we can prove beyond any shadow of a doubt was in Egypt. So going on here, it says, how did this mystical community evolve and why? The etymology of the word Essene, a moot topic, is Egyptian. Truly, it is derived from the word cache, which means secret. Also meaning secret and silent is a Jewish word of similar sound, chassis, which is translated Esse. The true origin of the Essenes is in the strange land of Egypt, where initiates of the ancient mystery schools enacted the Osirian mysteries. Osiris, remember we talked about Serapis Christ that was practiced there in Egypt and for a couple of hundred years and went all around the world. These were the mystery schools. The Osirian mysteries in their temples, where a secret gnosis or superiority of knowledge was transmitted by word of mouth to neophytes who were tested and found worthy, thus perpetuating an ancient tradition. In strict secrecy and confidence, the Cariebs, the masters, lectors, priests, imparted to the seekers for truth the esoteric wisdom which they received upon oath, never to reveal to the profane masses, nor to be set down on papyri scrolls. From far lands, students came to study philosophy at Thebes, Heliopolis, and Alexandria, where the mystery schools had established branches. Many profound thinkers journeyed to Egypt. Among them were Solomon, Pythagoras, Thales, Plato, and Democritus. From Egypt, this gnosis or esoteric knowledge spread to other lands during the centuries prior to the Christian era. In Greece were found the orders of the Therapeutae and the Pythagoreans, and in Palestine the community of the Essenes. Now, I believe it's Pliny or Philo that tells us that one of the names of the Essenes is the Therapeutae. He calls them the healers. And we all know that the Therapeutae was down at Luxor in Egypt. And that's where we actually find the Gnostic documents, the Gnostic scriptures or Christian scriptures from the first centuries, probably when they were actually written. And they were found near Luxor, Egypt, and they were the community of the Therapeutae. In the period between the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian New Testament, the Essenes of Palestine there also was an Essene organization in Alexandria. And as we've seen, there was an Essene priesthood at the Temple of Artemis. Had already established a branch in En-Gedi on the western shores of the Dead Sea. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, states that Essenes were to be found in every city. They were not a religious sect, as is often claimed. However, the Pharisees and Sadducees would have regarded them as such, since Essenic doctrines differed considerably from those of the former. Their spiritual head was referred to as the teacher of righteousness, which is the word Zadokite. So they were the Zadokite priests. And the community looked upon him as a Messiah, a Messiah, or anointed one. Essene commentators in their exegeses interpreted the suffering servant passages of Isaiah to refer to their own teacher of righteousness, the passages from the book of Habakkuk 2:4, which reads, "And the just shall live by his faith," which theologians interpret to mean Jesus, is in the Qumran manuscript interpreted as "the just shall live by their faith in the teacher of righteousness." The ancient historians Philo of Alexandria, Pliny the Elder, and Josephus wrote of these Essenes in their histories. Their writings reflect the deep admiration and respect they felt for the associates of the Essene community. Indeed, the Essenes were a wonder of the ancient world and have been called the brothers and sisters in white clothing, the silent ones, the pure ones, and the physicians. Notice the writer of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts is called Luke the physician, and he was an Essene. The Essenes practiced a form of community living wherein their property was jointly owned by the community. We see this as the Christian community at Jerusalem, where they were called Ebionites, or the poor. And the Apostle Paul would he would gather food and money or whatever he could get, commodities and stuff, and they took it to the poor in Jerusalem. In other words, he took it to the Ebionites, which is a group of the Essenes. The word Ebionite being translated to poor. Not that they were maybe not necessarily poor people, but they were called the poor because they had all things common. And of course, we see Paul being accused of being the ringleader of the Nazarenes. The Nazarenes is also a original name in the Bible of this sect. This is where it got its roots, all the way back from Miriam, the sister of Moses, who lived at Bethlehem, and that's where they produce all these high priests or Zadokite priesthood. The Essenes practiced a form of community living wherein their property was jointly owned by the community, a system which was adopted by the early church. In this community, there was a second chamber, or a hierarchy, which comprised of 12 individuals and 3 priests. Their initiates were required to serve a probationary period of 2 years. They were allowed to partake neither of the pure meal of the congregation until the completion of their first year, nor of the drink of the congregation until the completion of their second year. The candidates accepted by the council of the community would then enjoy the privileges of the community, and their personal possessions would form part of the common pool. Their community was self-sufficient. They pursued agriculture, though they were not exclusively vegetarians. They kept no slaves because they did eat fish and birds. Sometimes, not very often, they would do it at certain, when they would make vows and so forth, usually. A lot of them were strictly vegetarians because they never had to make a vow because their beard was long and their hair was long because they never broke their vow. So they kept no slaves, and each member was required to do his or her share of menial work. They offered no sacrifice. They did not swear to an oath. Remember, Jesus said, do not make oaths. Jesus was a Nazarite priest, which is the same as an Essene or an Ebionite or a Therapeutai. For their word was their bond. The populace of the day knew this, for even King Herod the Great exempted them from taking the oath of allegiance to the crown, nor did they participate in disputes concerning religion or politics. The Essenes built hospices. By the way, friends, I want to point this out here. When I say we shouldn't be involved in voting, the early apostles voted, but among themselves. They did not participate in voting for emperors or the politics of the day. They were no part of the world, meaning they did not participate in the worldly kings and laws and rules. They were under no law except the law of the community and the Holy Spirit, a communal living. The Essenes built hospices, the forerunner of modern hospitals, in many districts to assist the poor and needy and for the shelter of tired travelers. This formed a part of their humanitarian activities. Philo says that the aged among them were regarded with reverence and honor. I think that when if you guys out there ever decide, any of you, or maybe just some of you, decide you want to participate in the truth, the true Christian way of life, the way, which is to have all things common and to get into the wilderness before the tribulation begins. Keep in mind that the primary reason for this is for salvation, for health, for healing, because Jesus was a healer. Yes. Remember when he spit on the soil, on the clay, and put it in his eye? But we have much to learn about it, and it was all about herbs. And so the Hippocratic Oath originally was from these physicians, these healers, the hospitalers, the hospice. And these people took a vow, the Hippocratic Oath. They would not use drugs, and they would not use surgery or commit abortions, but they would only use herbs and the Holy Spirit. So the Manual of Discipline, the community of the New Covenant, the statutes that maintain strict discipline among its members, its code, and precepts are published under the titles of the Manual of Discipline and the Damascus Document. A copy of the Damascus Document was found in the Geniza, a storehouse for damaged Hebrew writings and ritual objects, at Cairo in the early 20th century, and was published in 1910 by Solomon Schitter, under the title Fragments of the Zadokite Work, while the Manual of Discipline has also been published as the rule for all the congregation or the community of Israel in the last days, and the community rule. In their communal life, they were particularly severe on those members who lied deliberately in matters of personal possessions, or bore a grudge against another, or transgressed any of the Mosaic laws, or spoken in. Now, remember, up until the time of Christ, many of these groups did keep the law of Moses to some extent. They certainly didn't keep the sacrificial part of the law. So it's not that simple to say they kept the law of Moses. Remember, when Jesus came, even his disciples, Peter, James, and John, and the rest, and Paul, were still keeping the law of Moses, because it hadn't yet been revealed yet that we are not bound to that law until Christ came. And they spoke in anger against priest or companion. In such cases, the member would be excluded from the assembly for a period of time and do penance. In a few cases, the member could be suspended but reinstated upon probation for consideration of his or her case by the many. For slandering or murmuring against the community, the penalty was excommunication for life. During an assembly of the congregation, they sat in ranks, and they were to speak in accordance with the degree of their advancement. They frowned upon foolish speech or foolish laughter, talking out of turn or interrupting another while he or she was speaking. These transgressions met with due punishment, as did sleeping or unnecessary exposure during a session for any of these offenses. The member would be doing penance and be temporarily excluded from the purity of the many. Though the Essenes, as a secret organization, went about their work quietly from time to time, certain members would go out and teach in public. The famous Essene, Menahem, became popular for his prophecy that Herod would one day reign as king of the Jews. Another Essene was John the Baptist, who Jesus said was Elijah returned. John heralded the news of the advent of the expected Savior. He urged repentance and practiced the Essene rite of baptism. See, as Christians, we don't do that anymore because Jesus came and did away with the law. So baptism was part of the old Jewish law. So close is the similarity between Essenic thought and the theology of Jesus that modern scholars are saying Jesus was a member of the Essene order. The Essenes, not unlike the many Jewish sects that flourished in Palestine, had anticipated that the Messiah would be born within their fold. The mysterious disappearance of the Essenes has often led to the belief that they merged into and became part of the Christian movement. This seems unlikely, for the Essenes were not a missionary group. Their members constituted an esoteric school. Well, the esoteric schools continued, but their leader was John the Baptist, and John told them to follow Jesus, and most of them did. There were some who did not, and this is where we get a lot of Masonic ideas today, because there was certain lines and groups that never accepted Jesus and revered John above Jesus. To this day, there are, amongst Masons, their primary beliefs goes back to these Essenes, and I don't think they ever really accepted Jesus. Of course, today they've lost all this information, and they probably don't even know what they believe. But this is what happened. So, the Essenes were not a missionary group. Their members constituted an esoteric school, and membership was limited to the few sincere and worthy seekers. There can be no doubt, however, that they enthusiastically supported the early Christian church. Indeed, Essenic influence upon Christianity has often brought about the statement that the Essenism is the mother of Christianity. Zend Avesta Scriptures, They were students of the Zendavesta scriptures, also the books of the prophetic writings of the Old Testament. So the Zendavesta is Zoroastrianism. And so Zoroastrianism is basically the same as the early religions of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob down through Egypt that spread these mystery schools spread all over the world. And Daniel became the head of the Magi. And so at that time, they understood that all these ancient temples around the world were all one and the same religion in various lands. And they all spoke and taught about the coming Messiah. And so these included the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. In their Qumran library, fragments of every book of the Old Testament, except the book of Esther, have been found. Preserved in its entirety is a text of the book of Isaiah. Some of the books found at the Qumran caves at one time formed part of the biblical canon, but were eventually discarded, such as the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. The Dead Sea Scrolls antedate the hitherto oldest extant manuscripts of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Masoretic text, by almost 1,000 years. What happened to the Essenes? It is believed that they fled their Dead Sea community during the First Jewish War, 66 to 70 CE, when the Roman 10th Legion was in the vicinity. The Essenes somehow anticipated this, for they carefully prepared themselves to depart. A serious problem, however, had to do with the transportation of their manuscripts. It is now known that they hid part of their library in the neighboring Qumran caves. Then they trekked to Mount Carmel. That's where Elijah started the school of the prophets. And that's up in Syria, or, northern Israel, bordering on Lebanon area. In Palestine, where they established their headquarters. As mystical students, the Essenes sought the summum bonum of existence, the evolution of their spiritual being. They pursued a study and quest for atonement with the deity's self, and the illumination gained from their experiences was to enhance the moral fiber of their existence and their humanitarian services to the world. They lived in simplicity and humility, in temperance and equity, and in purity and truth. Anyway, guys, I'm going to leave it there. We're about an hour now. I really hope that this video will put into your heart and into your mind clearly what the Bible really is about, what is going on in the world, the conspiracy that's going on, and why people aren't understanding the Bible. And, I'm sure there's still questions, but we've got a pretty good outline now. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, get it uploaded, and hope you guys have a wonderful evening. And we'll see you tomorrow. Lord bless you. Have a good one.